Worship today, I pray that this message today is a continuation of our worship. As Dwayne shared in his testimony time there, worship isn't just what happens in this time, but we limit it even more than that at times. Worship is just what happens when we sing. No, it's so much more than that. Our times when we come to His Word, that is an act of worship. And so I pray that as we open up His Word today, that will continue to be the reflection of our heart. Now, in our ongoing series, we're walking through the book of Daniel, and the title that I've given our message today is very simple: The Writing on the Wall. I mean, there's really no other description that you could give Daniel chapter 5 than just that key event that takes place in this story, the writing on the wall. Now I want to open with this question as we consider Daniel chapter 5 today. Have you ever had those aha moments in your life? Those times when you realize something was right there in front of you, and after you see it, you wonder, how did I miss it? Maybe some of you are nodding. You know what I'm talking about with those aha moments where you see something. For example, a picture like this. If you're strolling through the woods, this is a good time to have an aha moment. God certainly is a creative God, because that snake laying there on those leaves is very easily hidden there. That's a scary moment when you walk past that. Aha! And what was right in front of you, when it's suddenly brought to your attention, that changes everything. Well, as we look at Daniel chapter 5 today, we're going to see one of those moments where literally it was an aha moment. It was right before him, and as it was right before the king, that moment changed everything. How are you going to respond to what you saw revealed right there? You know, we need to ask that question even as we begin. When God speaks to our heart, or even in this service, what is God speaking to your heart? And then what are you doing in response to that? So far in our study of the book of Daniel, we've already covered a lot of ground. We began all the way back in chapter 1 talking about the resolve of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Their resolve to serve the Lord. Even as they were moved away from their homeland, they didn't move away from their God. They had a resolve. Regardless of the scenarios, the situations that were changing all around them, they remained committed to the Lord. An amazing example for each and every one of us. By chapter 2, Daniel is already being tested in his faithfulness. As he goes before the king, he has the task now of interpreting this vision, this dream by King Nebuchadnezzar. And what I loved about Daniel's response is he said, I will give the interpretation. And then he waited for the Lord to give it to him. He stepped out by faith. An incredible example of living by faith each and every day. As we came to chapter 3, you'll remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace. And once again, their resolve was tested. As they stood at the mouth of the furnace, they made a bold statement. They said, our God can deliver us. But even if He doesn't, we're still going to worship Him. They had a resolve to serve the Lord, unconditional. It didn't change with the moment. Last week as we came to Daniel chapter 4, we didn't get the story of Daniel's writing. We got the story of Nebuchadnezzar, giving testimony to the power of God, revealed to him, so much so that he went from the luxurious palace to grazing with cattle. He had quite a long fall there, and it was all for the purpose of drawing the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar to the one true king, the one who always would be seated on his throne. And so that's where we've been so far in our journey, and it brings us now to chapter 5. And a lot has happened once again. Now Nebuchadnezzar is no longer on the throne. In fact, to get us just to the point of chapter 5, there's been quite a number of changes in the throne. It was passed to Marduk. That was the first king that took the throne. And Marduk didn't reign near as long as his father. In fact, Marduk was assassinated by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. But just as quickly as Neriglissar came to the throne, within 4 years, he was taken out and he was replaced by another one, Marduk. Marduk was one that came in trying to pick out his curtains, and apparently he didn't even have time for that. He was only on the throne 9 months. And you know, that was not a good place to be at times. To be the number one man in the kingdom is often the very one that gets all of the attention pointed on him. And here the king, in rapid succession, they were changing. And from Marduk, there was a group of conspirators that came together. They took over the throne, and they appointed Nabonidus to the throne. Now, if you look at your text, you say, we're missing that. It doesn't say Nabonidus. Why does it say Belshazzar here? Well, Nabonidus didn't like Babylon a whole lot, and he decided, I want to move my palace to Tamar. And as he moved to Tamar, he appointed his son, Belshazzar. He married into the royal line of Nebuchadnezzar, and so now Belshazzar, his son, was directly a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, Belshazzar, you rule in Babylon. I'm ruling over here. I don't much care for Babylon. And so that's the character that our story focuses in on. Belshazzar, because God's story is about Babylon and not Tamar. That's why everything is about this one king. God had a plan to use Belshazzar in this grand narrative of continuing the story of the resolve that we need in serving faithfully before the Lord. And I want us to look at our points this morning. I've given you just very practical points that I believe would apply to our lives as we look at this story. And the first point is this: God invites us to break the patterns of past sin. That's the first point I want you to see. It's on the outline there on the back of your bulletin. God invites us to break the patterns of past sin. You're going to see this very quickly as we look at the life of Belshazzar. He had an opportunity to follow the example in good or bad as he looked back to his ancestors. Let's pick up there in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. What a powerful statement there of what was going on there in the palace there. They praised the God of silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. That's the picture of the worship that was taking place. They weren't worshiping the one true God. They were worshiping the God of bronze and silver, gold. These are the ones that we turn to. Now, if you've watched the news at all over the past few weeks, you know that guns have been right at the center of everything. And as that has been the center story in the news, there have been lots and lots of folks that have been running out to buy guns and to get training. Well, about a year and a half ago, I went through the training for CWP and went out with Sam there, and he gave me some pretty simple instructions. He said, you have to hit the target. I said, all right, I can do that. But I asked him a question. I said, do I have to hit my target? Sam didn't laugh. I'm glad y'all laughed. He didn't laugh. He said, yes, you have to hit your target. Well, you know, I'm not going to show you my target because, well, let's just say I tried to cover a lot of area. You know, I did hit the target. That's a good thing. Folks, this describes the worship that was taking place here. Little here, shoot over here, over here, over here. And in all the process, they were missing the bullseye. There was one object of worship that could be lifted up, but they were like a CWP candidate shooting all over the target. They were praising wood and stone and bronze and iron, all of these different things, but they were missing the one true thing, worshiping the one true God. And as he came to this point, as Belshazzar set up this scene, he had the opportunity to break the pattern of past sin, and he chose to turn away from that opportunity as he threw this grand party. Now, as we look at this celebration going on here, we could say that Belshazzar knew how to throw a celebration. Belshazzar the king made a feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. You would say, wow, he knew how to throw a festivity. I was reading about some of the parties that would have taken place in this time period. And archaeologists have looked back to see if some of the celebrations that are written about in this time, some that brought together celebrations of 15,000. It's said that when Alexander the Great had his festivities around his wedding, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 people came. They loved throwing a big party. And notice what it says about this festivity. It says there in verse 2, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple. They had taken those from Jerusalem. Now, I love the description here. It says, while he tasted the wine. It's kind of like a chocoholic saying, I'm just going to taste that cake over there. You know better, right? This wasn't just a wine tasting ceremony. This was a party. This was no line in the sand. There's no holds barred here. This was a celebration. And when they got to that point where all judgment had passed, they said, I've got an idea. Let's go get those museum pieces. You see, as kings would conquer a land, they would take the prized vessels of a land and they would keep those as really a symbol of our power, our authority, and so it was like a museum piece. Well, Belshazzar had an idea. Let's take that and let's party with those. In that moment, he had an opportunity to turn away from the past patterns of sin that he had seen in his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar, but instead he ran headlong right toward that, and he thought in that moment that he could exalt his authority. I can do anything that I want to. I am the most powerful man in the land. God is a patient God. Listen to the Bible, 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow in keeping His promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. You know, folks, I can't presume upon, I can't take for granted the patience of God. In that moment, Belshazzar saw himself as the most powerful king in the land. I am the one who calls all the shots. And in that moment, God's patience with this king ran out. Folks, as we look at opportunity after opportunity, when we come together in the study of His Word, when we come to the Lord in our prayer time, and God moves in our hearts, it's in that very moment that God invites us to respond. I've heard it said, a pastor, he shared with his congregation, he said, if I'm speaking, and I'm right in the middle of the message, and God says, get up and get to the altar, don't worry about me. I'll keep on talking. You get to the altar. Folks, when God speaks, we ought to respond. Well, in this moment, Belshazzar, he was so focused on the festivities, he missed the sinful reaction, this call to bring in those gold vessels. This doesn't mean a thing. That's that God of the past of Israel. We're on the throne now. But as we continue in our story, God invited Belshazzar to open his eyes to present circumstances. That's our second point. God invites us to open our eyes to present circumstances. We're going to continue here, and we're going to look at these cups that he brought in reserved for God. Well, Belshazzar thought it would be a wonderful addition to the party. Verse 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked together against each other. There was a very clear reaction. Now, I don't know what you would list as your number one fear, but usually when you do a kind of a survey of the top 10 fears that are routinely given, in the top 1, 2, or 3, what I'm doing right now is always right up there at the top. Public speaking. I've shared before that one of the first few times that I was called on to speak, I shared my testimony. I was probably about 15 years old. The youth minister said, go ahead, you share with the group your testimony. And I shared in vibrato. Not because I was singing, but because I was so nervous. I was just, my voice was shaking and I was terrified. Public speaking scared me to death. You know, as we think about what is it that you fear, well, Belshazzar was in that moment taken from celebration to great fear. Why? Because God's power was revealed in that moment. It says here that his knees knocked together, his eyes were open to his present circumstance. Folks, there's a lot of things that we do. We try to busy ourselves with events. We try to get in our routines and never slow down so that we won't see what's happening in our present circumstance. But when God opens our eyes to what's going on in our lives, in this very moment, once again, He's calling us right back to Himself. And in this moment here, Belshazzar certainly had his eyes opened. Again, archaeologists have found a great deal about these stories here, and one of those is the very palace where this story would have taken place. It's a huge room. The measurements were 55 feet wide, 170 feet long, and in that palace it had an indented place much like our choir loft, and they believe that's the very place where the king would have been seated. And as he was seated there on the throne, the image here is that above his throne was where the handwriting began. And the words were written there in order to grab the attention of the king, to turn his eyes away from his own power and his own party there, to see that God indeed was powerful and worthy of his attention in that moment. Notice in verse 8 and 9, here comes the response. What do I do with this message? Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. You know, as we look at these characters again, these wise men, there's no doubt there's a difference between them and Daniel, who we're going to read about once again. There was really an easy task to spot the difference. Let's look at a picture here. I want to allow you to look at these two pictures. It's going to be a little bit harder because of the distance here, and not like you're looking at a monitor. But there's 5 differences between the left picture and the right picture. Now, I'm not going to give you all day long to look at it, but maybe you can spot 1 or 2. Looking for several differences here between the left and the right. Now, you guys are awesome, because when I do this with student ministry, they immediately yell it out loud. You guys did pretty good. You kept it quiet. All right, let's see if we spotted any of the differences. The next one, we'll put some red arrows on all 5 differences here. The man here sitting a different direction. The sidewalk, the line is missing. The squirrel or bird there's only 1 where there was 2. The limb is missing. And then the tower there. Spotting the differences here. Well, you know, when I look at these wise men, he called them in just like those before him, just like Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe they'll be able to do it. But very easily you could spot the difference. You could see that they, just like those before them, had walked in before the king to try to give the interpretation, and they failed in that interpretation. Why? Well, because God had someone else He was going to use. God had another individual that He had already ordained from eternity past that was going to enter into this story, and we've seen it happen again and again, as Daniel was that faithful one that was called to the task. You know, I just long for my own life, for our church, for you individually, to be that man in waiting, that woman in waiting. See, God didn't have to take a long time to prepare Daniel for the task. All right, you know, King, if you'll hold off another week or 2, I've got some work I need to do in Daniel's life. He's kind of walked away from me, but I'm going to work on his heart. Once I get him back in line with me, then I'm going to use him. No, in that very moment, Daniel was ready. Folks, when we talk about revival, it's saying, God, would you stir in our hearts something so profound that it draws us to you like never before, so that we are that man in waiting, that woman in waiting, so that when God says, I've got a task, we say, God, I'm ready. Use me. Daniel was called in this moment because God was opening the eyes of Belshazzar to his present circumstances. You know, as we look at this story, we see a queen coming in. Most likely, scholars say this was his mother, actually. Some translations actually render it that way. The queen mother comes in, and she comes in with a recommendation. I know someone. I've got a word about an individual, a fellow that certainly can change the situation. His name is Daniel. Let's go to our 3rd point now. God invites us to acknowledge our sin in past rebellion. Daniel's somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 years old at this point in the story, and so not only has he been filled with wisdom throughout the story and is seeking God's Word, but he's also now filled with years and years of wisdom of living his life. So let's look now at chapter 5, verse 13, and we'll go down to verse 23, a larger section here. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Are you that Daniel, who is the one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I've heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Well, let's pause there just for a second. Historians tell us that Darius at this point had already surrounded the kingdom here of Belshazzar and Nabonidus. The defeat of the king was just within moments going to happen. And here the king is claiming this power. I'll give you all the royalty you could ever ask if you simply will do this. As we look at the story as well here, he says you could be the third ruler, again pointing to the fact that Belshazzar was the second in command. Daniel answered, though. Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. I love what happens here. The king asked for an interpretation. Daniel preached a sermon. You know, if you've been a follower of Christ and you're in your 80s, you're going to do what you want to do, right? You're going to be bold in your witness. And we see that in Daniel. He's been doing this all his life. And at this point, Daniel says, yeah, you called me for an interpretation. I'm going to give you a sermon. And he begins to preach to the king to tell him all of the rebellion in his heart, all of the ways that he had turned away from the Lord. And in that moment, God used Daniel to invite this powerful king to acknowledge his sin and past rebellion. He talks about the sin of pride, the sin of blasphemy, the sin of idols here. And it all leads up to that key moment there, the writing on the wall. I wonder how many of us here can look back to that time in our lives where the writing on the wall turned our hearts to the Lord. It may have been as simple as a vacation Bible school event where you heard the good news of Jesus Christ, and that was the writing on the wall that you said, I yield my life to the Lord. I was reading about the testimony of Trevor Bain on the I Am Second Testimonies. He was sharing about his own journey to really being a servant of the Lord. And I don't lift him up as this perfect example. We never should do that with any athlete or anyone, period. But he gives the testimony of how God really opened his eyes. He was driving down the freeway quite a number of years ago, and through a series of events, his car began to tumble and flip until it became resting on its side, and a car actually ran into the top of his vehicle. Every report said he should have died, but God spared his life. And in that very moment, he shares in his testimony, he said, that for me was the writing on the wall, that moment where I realized, yeah, God was a part of my life, but he didn't dictate what I did and who I was. And so for Trevor Bain, he said, in that moment, I yielded my life once again to the Lord. You know, for all of us here, we've had those moments, if we've trusted in Christ, where we've had the writing on the wall that said, it's time for you to return to the Lord, or it's time to give your heart to the Lord. The question is, are we willing to acknowledge our sin and past rebellion and turn our lives to the Lord? Well, as we look at the story here, notice what Daniel said. The God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you've not glorified. That was the message shared, and we see our fourth point in this. God invites us to weigh our obedience. God invites us to weigh our obedience in present service. Let's pick up in verse 24 down to verse 31. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, which is another form of upharsin. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. God invites us to weigh our obedience in present service. Folks, the writing on the wall isn't just for those that are far away from the Lord, but also for us, that we would weigh our obedience, look before the Lord and say, God, when you look at me, do you find that I measure up to the call that you've placed on my life? When you look at this word, mene, is the idea of your number being up. All of us have been at the Department of Motor Vehicles at some point or another, and when you go in, they give you that little receipt. And it has a combination there, a letter and a number. And for the next 30 minutes or so, you've never been more focused on that letter and that number, waiting for your number. Oh, finally. Well, that's the idea here. Belshazzar had been pushing the patience of God, and finally his number was up. He had rebelled. He had made a mockery of God, and God could withstand it no more. Mene. Then he said tekel. The idea is that he was placed on a scale, and he didn't meet the required weight here. He was too light for the task. Upharsin or Perez, it signified that his kingdom was about to be divided. Folks, when we look at our lives, do we look at our hearts and say, I measure up to the task? Do we look at our lives and say, I've been dieting way too long, I don't fit the call or the task that God is calling me to, and so maybe it's time that I feast on His Word. It's time that I feast on who He is, so that when I see that writing on the wall in my life, I can say, thank you, Lord, you've done that work of preparing my heart. I am ready for the task you're calling me to. We started with a question. As we began, the question was really about when it's right before you. When God reveals it right before you, what do you do? When God opens your eyes to present circumstances, what do you do in response? I believe what Dwayne was sharing about just the testimony of even walking through the mall, that's a testimony of God speaking to our hearts, and immediately we respond. When God looks at your life today, does He find you lacking? Today is the opportunity to say, God, I respond. Dwayne, I'm going to ask if you'll come and have our closing prayer. We're going to have an opportunity for you to come and just pray here at the altar. And our prayer today is that we truly would turn our eyes upon Him. So Dwayne's going to offer our closing prayer today, and he's going to receive you as we come to this invitation time. If he can pray for you in any way, we'd love to do that. Dwayne, you pray.
Father, thank